Hannah Brooks did not cry when she stepped off that stagecoach. She had already used up every tear she had standing over her sister's grave 3 weeks before, Emma pressed against her chest, 8 months old, and screaming into the cold Kansas air. Now she stood in the Wyoming dirt carpet bag at her feet, baby on her hip, and stared at the man who had posted the advertisement and watched his face go from expectation straight to something cold and final. "You didn't say anything about a child," Jacob Walker said. "No," Hannah answered. "I didn't." If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1889, and find out what happens when a desperate woman, a grieving man, and one tiny baby get trapped together by a storm neither one of them saw coming. The stagecoach pulled away before Hannah had fully steadied herself on the ground, and the dust it left behind settled over her shoes and the hem of her dress and the soft dark hair of the baby balanced on her right hip. Emma had finally stopped fussing somewhere around the last mile of road worn out from 2 weeks of rattling coaches and smoky railroad cars, and the particular misery of an infant who cannot understand why the world keeps moving when all she wants is stillness. Hannah understood that feeling better than she could say. She looked at the land spreading out in front of her. Wyoming in late summer had a particular way of sitting under the sky, wide and flat near the base of things, then rising sharply into hills that turned blue-gray at the edges, the kind of country that made a person feel very small and very visible at the same time. The ranch itself was a collection of low buildings set back from the main road, weathered timber that had seen hard winters and harder men, a barn that leaned slightly west as though it had been thinking about leaving for years and hadn't quite committed. Fencing ran in every direction. Cattle moved in the middle distance like slow brown clouds. It was nothing like the advertisement had described, and it was also exactly what the advertisement had described. Help wanted, experienced cook, honest and hard-working, room and board, provided wages fair. No mention of wilderness. No mention of isolation. No mention of the fact that the nearest town sat 12 miles behind her on a road that had already started looking uncertain in the afternoon light. Hannah shifted Emma to her left hip, picked up her carpetbag with her right hand, and walked toward the main house. She had gone perhaps 30 feet when the front door opened. Jacob Walker was taller than she had imagined from his letter, which had been brief and direct, and offered nothing about the man behind it, except a neat signature at the bottom. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just long enough to see Emma to understand what he was looking at, and then he came down the porch steps with the deliberate pace of a man who has already made up his mind about something, and is simply walking toward the conversation that confirms it. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the baby. He looked at Hannah. "You didn't say anything about a child," he said. His voice was flat. Not cruel, not yet, but flat the way a door sounds when it's already been decided that it's closing. "No," Hannah said. "I didn't." The advertisement said experienced cook. It said nothing about... He gestured toward Emma, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man who ran a working ranch and had no patience for complications he hadn't budgeted for. "About a baby." "That's true," Hannah said. She did not apologize. She had promised herself on the stagecoach that she would not open with an apology, because an apology was a surrender, and she could not afford to surrender before she had even unpacked her single bag. Jacob studied her. She stood still and let him, because she had learned in the last 3 weeks that stillness was sometimes the only power a woman without options actually possessed. She was not a small woman, she never had been, and she had long since stopped pretending otherwise, and she held Emma against her side with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with the weight and the responsibility both. "I need a cook," Jacob said finally. "Not a nursemaid situation. The men work from before sunup. They need hot food and strong coffee, and they need it on time every single morning, no exceptions. I can't have someone stopping to tend a baby in the middle of..." "She sleeps until 5, Hannah said. "I'm up at 4. By the time she wakes, the bread's already in the oven, and the coffee's on, and your men will have biscuits on the table before they've finished pulling their boots on." Jacob looked at her. "She's 8 months old," Hannah continued. "She's not walking yet. She's not running loose through your kitchen. She sits where I put her, and she watches what I'm doing, and she doesn't cry except when she's hungry or tired. And I know her schedule well enough now that I can have her fed and settled before any meal needs to come together." "You've been caring for her long?" "3 weeks. Something shifted in Jacob's face, too brief, too controlled to read clearly. 3 weeks isn't long." "No," Hannah agreed. "It isn't." He waited as though he expected her to explain more. She didn't. Not yet. "Some things you offered when they were asked for, and some things you held close until the moment was right," and Hannah had learned the difference the hard way. Jacob pulled his hat from his head and turned it once in his hands, a gesture she would later learn that meant he was working something out. "Where'd you come from?" "Wichita. Before that, Abilene." "You cook professionally." "I cooked for the Garrison Hotel in Abilene for 4 years. Before that, I cooked for a boarding house in Dodge City. I can do breakfast for 30 men and have the dishes clean before noon. I can make biscuits from memory in the dark. I know how to stretch a beef roast into 3 meals and make every one of them taste like the first. You'll have no complaints from your men about the food, Mr. Walker. I can promise you that much." She watched him process this. She watched him look at Emma again, at the baby's round face, her dark eyes blinking steadily in the afternoon light, one small fist curled against Hannah's collarbone. "The advertisement didn't say anything about a baby," he said again, but slower this time, less certain. "No," Hannah said. "It didn't. And I knew that when I answered it. I knew you might send me back, and I answered it anyway because I needed the work and Emma needed a roof, and there wasn't a simpler solution available to me at the time. Why not leave her with family?" Hannah looked at him evenly. "I am her family." That landed differently than the rest. She saw it in the slight change around his eyes, not softness, not yet, but something like recognition. The way a person looks when they've heard a sentence that carries more inside it than the words themselves. Jacob put his hat back on. He looked out toward the barn. He looked back at Hannah. He looked at the road behind her, the empty road, the road that was growing darker at the far end where clouds had begun piling up on the horizon in the way that meant something serious was coming. "One night," he said. "There's a room off the kitchen, small. You can use it tonight. In the morning I'll arrange for someone to take you back to Sheridan, and you can find transport from there." Hannah nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It's not generosity. It's just—" He stopped, looked at the sky again. "It's getting late and that weather doesn't look friendly." He turned and went back up the steps and into the house, and the door didn't slam behind him, but it closed with the kind of finality that made the point without the noise. Hannah stood there for a moment with Emma on her hip and the carpet bag at her feet and the prairie wind starting to pick up around her, and she breathed in once slowly, the way she'd taught herself to do when the panic tried to rise. "Well," she said quietly to the baby, "at least it's one night." Emma looked up at her with the serious, wondering expression she wore when she was taking stock of a new place, and then she reached out and grabbed a fistful of Hannah's collar and held on. "That's right," Hannah said. "You hold on." She picked up the bag and went inside. The kitchen was not what she expected, and she had learned not to expect much. It was large, larger than the hotel kitchen she'd worked in Abilene, with a cast-iron stove that was good quality and had been well maintained, a fact that told her something about the man who owned it, even if he'd never intended to reveal it. There were shelves of canned goods and dry staples arranged with a certain rough logic. Copper pots hung on proper hooks, a work table that was scrubbed, but not recently. The room had the feeling of a space that was used hard and cared for adequately, but not loved, not the way a kitchen ought to be loved. Hannah set her bag down and settled Emma on the floor with the worn cloth rabbit she carried everywhere and began opening cupboards. She wasn't planning to cook. She had told herself she wasn't. She was only here for one night, and in the morning she would be back on the road with no clear destination and a baby on her hip and considerably less money than she'd been hoping to earn. She had no reason to start anything. She found flour and lard and a crock of buttermilk. She found dried beans soaking in a pot that someone had started and then apparently forgotten. She found a ham bone with enough meat on it to do something useful and onions and a handful of herbs tied in a bundle and hung above the window. She was not going to cook. She put on an apron she found hanging on a hook near the door. By the time the cowboys came in from the evening's work, the kitchen smelled like something that had no business existing in a bachelor ranch house. Like bread baking and bean soup with ham, and a sweetness underneath, that turned out to be dried apple slices she'd found in a tin near the back of the highest shelf. She had Emma propped in the corner of the work table with a clean dish towel folded beneath her and the rabbit in her lap, and the baby was watching the whole operation with the delighted concentration of a small person who has discovered that this particular human does interesting things with her hands. The first cowboy through the door was a wide man, gray at the temples, with the look of someone who had spent 40 years being surprised by nothing. He stopped in the doorway and breathed in. "Lord Almighty," he said. "Sit down," Hannah told him. "Bread needs 5 more minutes." He sat down. The second cowboy came in, stopped the same way, looked at Hannah, looked at Emma, looked at the stove, and sat down without a word. By the time the third and fourth came through, younger men barely past 20 who came in arguing about something and stopped mid-sentence. There were 6 men at the table, and the bread was out of the oven, and Hannah was ladling soup, and nobody had asked her a single question. Not yet. She was cutting the bread when Jacob came in. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table full of men. He looked at Hannah. He looked at the bread cooling on the board and the pot of soup, and Emma sitting quietly on the work table, watching everything with her wide, dark eyes. Hannah met his gaze. "The beans were already soaking," she said. "It seemed a waste." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. The wide, gray-haired man Hector, she would learn, who had worked the Walker Ranch for 11 years, leaned toward Jacob and said in a low voice that he clearly intended to be private, and wasn't quite, "You tell her she can't stay, and I will personally ride you to the county line myself." "Hector," Jacob said, "I'm just saying." "I heard what you said." "Good soup," one of the younger ones offered. "Best I've had since," he seemed to calculate. "Since ever, maybe." Hannah did not smile, because she had learned that smiling too soon at a compliment made you seem like you needed it. And she didn't need it, not from them anyway. She appreciated it. There was a difference. She cleaned Emma up from the small bowl of mashed beans she'd managed to eat, and settled her against her shoulder, and ate her own supper, standing at the counter, the way she always did when she was the one who had cooked it, and there wasn't a natural place for her at a table that belonged to someone else. She was almost finished when Jacob said, without looking up from his bowl, "There's a chair." She looked at him. "At the end of the table," he said. "There's a chair." She looked at the empty chair. She looked back at him. He was still not looking at her, focused on his soup, in the manner of a man who has said something that cost him more than it appeared to, and is not interested in discussing it further. Hannah pulled out the chair and sat down. Outside, the wind had gotten serious. They could all hear it now, that particular low moan that the Wyoming prairie made when it meant business, when it was building toward something bigger than just a cold night. One of the younger cowboys got up and checked the latch on the kitchen window without being asked. Hector was looking at the ceiling the way experienced men look at ceilings when they're listening to weather. "Storm's coming," Hector said. "Yes," Jacob said. "Road to Sheridan'll be mud before midnight." "Yes," Jacob said again. He did not look at Hannah. Hannah did not say anything either. She held Emma against her shoulder and felt the baby's breathing slow into the particular rhythm of near sleep. And she looked at the full table and the good food and the warm kitchen, and outside the wind built and built, and somewhere in the distance, the first low roll of thunder announced itself like a promise. She told herself not to feel anything yet. She told herself one night was one night, and the morning would come the same way mornings always came, and she would deal with it then. Emma sighed against her shoulder and went fully softly, completely asleep. Hannah pressed her cheek against the baby's head and breathed. One night. She would deal with the rest in the morning. But the thunder rolled again closer this time, and Jacob Walker finally looked up from his soup bowl, and his eyes met hers across the length of the table, and something passed between them, in that half-second that neither one of them had words for. Yet some recognition, some reckoning. Something that had the feeling of a door swinging open, that both of them had been leaning against from opposite sides for a very long time. He looked away first. Hannah looked down at Emma. The storm came in hard, just after 9 o'clock, and it took the road to Sheridan with it, and there was no more talk of morning arrangements that night. And nobody, not Jacob, not Hector, not any of the men who filed back to the bunkhouse pulling their collars up against the rain, brought it up again. Hannah washed the dishes in the small warm kitchen, while lightning split the sky outside the window, and Emma slept in the middle of the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, and the ranch held its breath around them both. And something that had been absent from those walls for a very long time began quietly and without announcement to consider returning. She did not know his story yet. She did not know about the fever year, or the graves on the hill behind the north pasture, or the way Jacob Walker had trained himself to need nothing and want nothing and expect nothing from anyone, because wanting had cost him everything once, and he had decided long ago that once was enough. She only knew that the dishes were clean, and the baby was sleeping, and the storm was loud, and she was still improbably here. And somehow, on this night of all nights that felt like enough to build something from. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and listened to the rain, and did not let herself think too far ahead, and did not let herself hope too hard. And outside, the thunder moved across the Wyoming sky like the world itself was rearranging, making room for something that hadn't existed this morning, and was only just now beginning to find its shape. The morning after the storm came in, gray, and still the kind of quiet that follows violence when the world hasn't yet decided what it wants to be next. Hannah was already at the stove before 4 o'clock. She hadn't slept much. The room off the kitchen was small, and the storm had been loud, and Emma had woken twice, once frightened by lightning, once simply hungry. And Hannah had moved through both wakings in the dark with the automatic precision of someone who has learned to function on whatever sleep the night decides to give her. She fed the baby. She settled the baby. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain slow and then stop, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she decided that lying there was less useful than standing up, so she stood up. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire in the stove first, the way she'd been taught, because everything else in a kitchen depends on heat, and heat takes time, and time is the one thing you cannot recover once it's gone. While the stove worked itself up, she mixed the biscuit dough by feel and memory, her hands moving through flour and lard and buttermilk in the dark, with the ease of a woman who has made this particular thing so many times that her body simply knows. She set the first pan in the oven. She started the coffee. She went back to check on Emma still sleeping, fist curled under her chin, entirely unconcerned with the logistics of the morning, and then she came back and started on the rest. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window began to lighten at the edges, she had biscuits done, and a second batch ready to go, in a pot of oatmeal, moving steadily on the back burner, bacon laid out and beginning to speak in the particular sizzling language of cast iron and heat and coffee that smelled even to her own nose like something worth waking up for. She heard him before she saw him. Jacob Walker moved quietly for a large man. But there's a particular board in an old house that always gives a person away, and she heard it. One low creak from the hallway, then footsteps, then a pause just outside the kitchen door that lasted long enough to mean something. He came in. He was already dressed, which told her he hadn't slept particularly well either, though she would not have said so. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the stove and the table and the biscuits cooling on the board, and Emma still asleep through the open door of the small room, and then at Hannah. And his face did the thing it had done the night before that brief internal calculation, like a man running numbers that aren't adding up the way he expected. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "The fire was cold," Hannah said. "I don't do well with a cold kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the table and sat down the way a man sits when he is tired and the chair is there and his legs have made the decision for him. She poured him coffee without asking. She set it in front of him and went back to the bacon. He drank it. He didn't say anything for a while, and she didn't fill the silence because she had learned that some men needed quiet the way other men needed talking, and pushing into a man's quiet before he was ready to give it up was a fast way to lose whatever ground you'd managed to gain. "Road'll be passable by midday," he said finally. "All right," Hannah said. "I can have Hector drive you into Sheridan. You can get a room at the hotel there. Find your feet, figure out. I can make 30 men breakfast in under an hour," Hannah said. She was still facing the stove. She did not turn around. "I can do it every morning without complaint, including mornings after storms when everyone's short on sleep and short on patience. I can do lunch and dinner on top of that and keep this kitchen running clean enough that you'll never have a sick man from bad food. I can do all of that and keep Emma quiet and out of everyone's way, and I'll do it for whatever you think is fair, and I won't ask for a single thing beyond the room and meals and the wages you'd pay anyone else." Silence. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for the job you advertised." She turned around then because the bacon needed turning, and because she wanted to see his face when she said the next part. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Walker. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you deserve the truth about what you're dealing with, and the truth is that this job was the best option available to me and Emma both, and I'd like the chance to prove that hiring me was the best option available to you." Jacob was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not hard, not soft. Somewhere in between the face of a man standing at a fork in a road and genuinely uncertain which direction leads somewhere worth going. From the small room, Emma made the small preliminary sounds that meant she was waking up. Hannah watched Jacob's eyes move toward the sound. She watched something happen in his face. Not softness exactly, but a loosening, like a fist that's been held tight for so long, it's forgotten how to be a hand. 6 men in the bunkhouse," he said. 4 more who come in for roundup. Breakfast at 5, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Sundays, lunch only." Hannah nodded. "I can do that." "The room's yours. Wages are $12 a month." "Fair." "The men?" He stopped. Started again. "The men aren't used to a woman in the kitchen. Or a baby. They'll come around. Give them a few days." "I'm not worried about the men," Hannah said. She thought she saw for just a fraction of a second something that might have been the beginning of a smile on Jacob Walker's face. It was gone before she could be certain. He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at her one more time with that measuring expression, and then he said, "Breakfast smells good," in a voice that made it sound like those 3 words had cost him something, and then he walked back out of the kitchen, and she heard his boots on the porch, and then she was alone with the bacon and the biscuits, and the sound of Emma fully waking up in the next room, talking to her rabbit in the private language of babies who have not yet learned that the world requires more complicated communication. Hannah allowed herself one full breath of relief. Then she went to get the baby. The men came in at 5 the way Jacob had described, rough and quiet, pulling off hats, finding chairs, the particular choreography of working men who have eaten together long enough that they no longer have to negotiate the space. Hector was first the way he had been the night before, and he looked at the biscuits and looked at Hannah and sat down with the satisfied expression of a man whose faith in something has been vindicated. "You're still here," he said. "Appears so," Hannah said. "Good," he said, and that was that. The younger ones came in pairs. The first pair, she learned their names over the course of breakfast. Pete and Cal Cousins from Nebraska, who had followed each other into ranch work, the way cousins sometimes do, stopped when they saw Emma installed in a large wooden box Hannah had padded with a folded blanket and set in the corner of the kitchen away from the stove. Emma sat in it with her rabbit and a wooden spoon Hannah had given her, methodically banging the spoon against the side of the box with the focused energy of someone engaged in important work. Pete looked at Cal. Cal looked at Pete. "That's a baby," Cal said. "Yes, it is," Hannah said. "Biscuits are on the table." Cal sat down. Pete crouched down near the box at a careful distance and said, "Hey there, little." And Emma looked up at him with her enormous dark eyes, and held out the wooden spoon with an expression of great seriousness, as though offering him the opportunity to participate in whatever she was doing. Pete looked helpless. "Is she, should I—" "You can take the spoon," Hannah said. "She'll want it back in about 30 seconds. Pete took the spoon. Emma watched him holding it. Then she held out her hand, and Pete gave it back, and Emma went back to banging, and Pete stood up, looking like a man who has had an unexpectedly significant experience and isn't entirely sure what to do with it. He sat down and ate 4 biscuits. The other 2 men, older, quieter. One named Roy, who had a beard and said almost nothing. One named Danny, who made up for Roy by talking enough for both of them, came in together and ate without much ceremony. Though Danny did pause on his way out to look at Emma and say, "Cute kid." And Hannah thanked him. And that was the beginning of Danny deciding that Hannah was all right. She had learned over the years that in a room full of strangers, you only needed to win one of them over quickly, and the rest would follow at their own pace. In this case, it turned out to be Hector, rather than Danny Hector, who had been on this ranch long enough to understand what it had been before, and what it had slowly stopped being, and who apparently saw in Hannah something that the ranch had been missing, and was not shy about saying so, at least to her. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, after the others had gone back out to work, hat in hand, with the look of a man who has something to say, and has decided to say it directly. "How long you planning to stay?" he asked. "As long as Mr. Walker will have me," Hannah said. Hector nodded slowly. "You know anything about this place before you came?" "Only what the advertisement said." "It didn't say much." "No." Hannah agreed. It didn't. Hector turned his hat once. "Good ranch," he said. "Good man. Lost his family going on 12 years ago. Now fever took his mother, his father, his younger brother inside of 6 weeks. He was 23. Been running this place by himself since then." He paused. "By himself." Hannah kept washing dishes. She understood that he was telling her something important, and she understood that the correct response was to let him finish. "He's not a man who warms easy," Hector said. "Keeps himself pretty far back from things, from people." Another pause. "He didn't kick you out this morning." "No," Hannah said. "That means something. For him, that means considerable." He put his hat back on. "Just thought you ought to know." He left, and Hannah stood at the sink for a moment with her hands in the dishwater, and thought about a 23-year-old man standing at 3 graves on a Wyoming hillside with no one left, and thought about what that kind of loss does to a person over 12 years of carrying it alone. And then she went back to washing dishes, because the work was there, and it needed doing, and some things you could only understand slowly over time, the way all real understanding happens. The first week passed in a rhythm that Hannah built deliberately, the way you build anything that needs to last, with attention to the foundations before you worry about the rest. She learned the men's preferences without asking directly by listening and watching Hector liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Pete and Cal took theirs with sugar, if there was any, which meant she made sure there always was. Roy, who spoke in complete sentences approximately twice a day, brightened noticeably at cornbread, which told her something about where he'd grown up. Danny would eat anything put in front of him, and compliment all of it, which made him easy to cook for, but difficult to actually read. Jacob was the hardest to learn. He ate whatever she made cleanly, and without complaint, and that was useful information in itself. It meant the food was right, but it told her almost nothing about him as a person. He came in for meals with the other men, but held himself slightly separate, not coldly, just with the particular self-containment of someone who has lived alone inside their own head for long enough that existing in a room full of people requires a kind of ongoing negotiation he hasn't entirely figured out. He did not speak to her much, but he did things. He split the firewood for the kitchen without being asked. She came out one morning to find it stacked neatly beside the door, more than she would need for several days, and nobody claimed responsibility. But she knew. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been sticking. She mentioned it once in passing, not to him specifically, but to the general room. And the next morning, the cabinet opened smooth. When Emma developed a small cough in the second week, nothing serious. Just the adjustment of tiny lungs to Wyoming air. There was a jar of something on the kitchen table the following morning. No note that turned out to be a honey and herb mixture that Hector confirmed when she asked had been mixed by Jacob himself from something his mother had made. Hannah held the jar for a moment when Hector told her that. "His mother's recipe," she said. Hector looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't make much of it out loud, but she thought about it a great deal. In the evenings when supper was cleaned up and Emma was fed and beginning to wind toward sleep, the men gathered in the bunkhouse and Jacob generally retreated to the small room off the main hall that served as his office, and the household kept its own company. But sometimes, not every night, not even most nights, but sometimes Hannah would hear him pause in the hallway outside the kitchen on his way past, and she never called out or made it awkward, just went on with whatever she was doing, and after a moment, she'd hear him continue on. She understood these pauses. They were a man standing at a threshold, not sure whether to come in, not yet ready to stay away entirely. She didn't push. She had learned the hard way that you cannot hurry a person towards something they need to find themselves. You could only make the destination worth arriving at when they were finally ready. The second week brought the first real test. It started with a man named Crawford. He arrived on a Wednesday with a wagon and the bearing of someone who has never once in his life been told he wasn't the most important person in a room and has constructed his entire personality around the assumption that this will continue to be the case. He was somewhere between 40 and 50, thick across the shoulders, with a rancher's tan and a merchant's eyes, the kind that were always adding up the value of what they were looking at. He was looking for Jacob. Jacob wasn't back from the north pasture yet. He came into the kitchen instead. "You must be the new cook," he said, looking her over in the way that some men look at women they've decided don't warrant full attention, a flat assessing sweep, like checking the condition of furniture. "I am," Hannah said. She did not offer her name because he hadn't offered his. "Tom Crawford. I've got the ranch south of Walker's." "What can I do for you, Mr. Crawford?" He smiled, and the smile had the particular quality of a man who believes smiling at women constitutes a form of generosity. "Just waiting on Walker. You got coffee?" She poured him coffee. He sat down at the table without being invited and stretched his legs out and looked around the kitchen with proprietary interest. "Place looks different," he said. "Walker's had 3 cooks through here in 2 years. None of 'em lasted." He looked at Hannah. "You planning to stick?" "That's my intention." He drank the coffee. "Nice enough coffee." He said it like a concession. "Heard there was a baby too. That true?" Emma was in her box in the corner, engaged in serious conversation with her rabbit. "That's Emma," Hannah said. Crawford looked at the baby with an expression that was not unkind, but was definitely unconcerned, the way a person looks at something they've categorized as someone else's problem. "Whose is she?" "Mine," Hannah said. "Your husband's out west somewhere, working." "I'm not married, Mr. Crawford." His eyebrows moved. Not dramatically, he was a man who kept his reactions controlled as a matter of professional habit, but they moved. "Cook and an unmarried mother," he said, and there was something in the way he assembled those words that made them sound like a verdict. "Walker know the full situation. Mr. Walker knows everything relevant to the work I was hired to do," Hannah said. Her voice was level. She had learned that level was more effective than sharp in situations like this. Sharp made a man feel attacked, and an attacked man doubled down, but level made a man feel assessed, which was a different kind of discomfort. Crawford looked at her more carefully. He reassessed something. "Just making conversation," he said. "Of course," Hannah said. He was on his second cup of coffee when Jacob came in. The change in Crawford was immediate and instructive. He stood up, his whole posture shifting from the loose ease of a man in temporary command of a space to the more careful positioning of a man who knows his actual standing in the room. Jacob Walker. Hannah noted had that effect without apparently trying. "Tom," Jacob said. He did not look particularly pleased to see him, though he was not impolite. "Jacob. Came to talk about the fence line on the eastern boundary. My boys found a section down." I know about the section. We had weather. You planning to get it fixed before your cattle wander onto my land? My cattle were on their side of the line before your boys found it, and they'll be on their side after it's fixed. End of the week. Crawford nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he tilted his head toward Hannah, in the particular way of a man who assumes another man shares his perspective on things. New cook's got a situation, he said. Jacob looked at him. Crawford kept going the way some men do, when they should have stopped. Unmarried, baby. Just thought you'd want to. Hannah's situation is her own business, Jacob said. His voice was quiet, and the quietness of it was more effective than volume would have been. And mine since she works here, which makes it not yours. Crawford blinked. I was just... Fence'll be fixed by Friday. Safe ride home, Tom. There was a pause that Crawford used to recalculate several things, and then he picked up his hat and said, Right, good enough, and left. Hannah did not say anything. She turned back to the stove and kept working because making a moment of it would have cost more than it gained. But she was aware intensely, quietly aware of Jacob Walker standing in the kitchen for a moment longer before he left to go back to work, and she was aware of what had just happened and what it meant. He had not hesitated. He had not qualified. It had not framed it as anything other than what it was, a door closed firmly between Hannah and the kind of judgment that had followed her since she'd taken Emma and made herself a target for every opinion that small-minded people feel entitled to share. He had done it without being asked. He had done it like it was the obvious thing to do. She stood at the stove for a long moment after his footsteps faded. Then Emma banged her spoon against the box and said, Bah, which was one of her two current words, and Hannah turned around and said, That's right, sweetheart, and went back to making lunch. The third week brought something unexpected. It was Pete who started it, which surprised her, because Pete was the younger of the two cousins, and the quieter one, the one who had been struck mute by Emma's wooden spoon in the first week, and had not quite recovered his composure around the baby since. But Pete turned out to be beneath the quiet, a man of unexpected practical creativity, and one morning, Hannah came into the kitchen to find that the large wooden box she'd been using as Emma's daytime station had been fitted overnight with a padded bottom and smooth sides and a small rail along one edge that would allow Emma to pull herself up when she was ready. Hannah ran her hand along the rail. The wood was sanded perfectly smooth. There wasn't a splinter in it. She found Pete at breakfast and said, Did you do that? Pete turned a remarkable color. Box was uncomfortable looking, he muttered. For the kid. It was very thoughtful, Hannah said. Pete became even more alarmed by the directness of the compliment and retreated behind his coffee cup. Cal leaned over and said in a theatrical whisper, He worked on it 2 nights. Woke me up with the sanding. Cal, Pete said, I'm just saying she should know the level of commitment. I will end you. Gentlemen. Hannah said mildly, and they both straightened up. But after that, after Pete's box and Cal's reaction to it, something shifted in the bunkhouse's relationship to Emma in a way that was small at first, and then became impossible to ignore. Roy, who communicated primarily in silence and occasional grunts, appeared one morning with a small carved wooden horse that he set on the kitchen work table without comment and left before anyone could respond. Danny, who was always talking, turned out to be the one among them who could make Emma laugh the most reliably. He'd discovered that making a particular face caused her to dissolve into the hiccuping whole-body laughter of babies who find something genuinely funny, and he deployed this ability with the enthusiasm of a man who has found his calling. The bunkhouse, as Hector put it one evening with the satisfaction of a man noting a change he'd been hoping for, had gotten considerably less sharp at the edges. Used to be a lot of card games, he said. A lot of arguing about card games. And now, Hannah asked. Hector considered. Now Pete spent 40 minutes last night trying to whittle a rabbit because Emma's is getting worn out, and he thought she might like a new one. Hannah looked down at her hands. He's not a very good whittler, Hector added, but he's committed. She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed, really laughed, not the polite kind, since she'd arrived, and it surprised her the way a genuine laugh does when you've forgotten you were capable of one. Hector watched her with something like satisfaction. "Good to hear that," he said. "That sound." She didn't ask him what he meant. She thought she understood. What she didn't expect, what she was not prepared for, was Jacob. It happened on a Thursday evening, in the 4th week after supper, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Emma was down for the night, and Hannah was finishing the last of the dishes in the quiet kitchen. She heard him in the hallway, the familiar pause, the familiar moment of consideration. And then, for the first time, instead of continuing on to his office, he came in. He sat down at the table. He didn't say anything immediately. Hannah finished the dish she was washing and set it aside and dried her hands and waited. "How is she doing?" he said. "Emma." "Better," Hannah said. "The cough is gone. Whatever was in that jar worked well." He nodded. He looked at the table. "My mother made it for me when I was small, every winter." Hannah sat down across from him. Not close, just at the table, the way you sit with someone when you want the conversation to continue, but you don't want to press it. "Hector told me you lost your family," she said. "I'm sorry. I hope it's all right that he told me." "Hector tells people what he thinks they need to know," Jacob said. There was no irritation in it, just a statement of fact. "He's usually right." Was he right this time? Jacob considered that with the seriousness he seemed to bring to most things. "Probably," he said. "It was a long time ago. Long enough that it shouldn't still—" He stopped. Started differently. "You learn to work around it, like a bad joint. You know it's there, you adjust for it, you keep moving." Hannah thought of her sister. She thought of 3 weeks ago, the grave in Kansas that she'd left behind her because she had to keep moving, had to, because Emma needed her to. "Yes," she said. "You do." He looked at her then. Really looked the way he hadn't quite done before, directly, with the full weight of his attention, which turned out to be considerable. "Why didn't you put her name in the advertisement?" he asked. "Emma's. You had to know it would come up." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because if I'd put it in the advertisement, most people wouldn't have written back. And I needed someone to write back. So you waited until you were already here?" "I waited until I was already here." He held her gaze. "That was a risk." "Yes," Hannah said. "It was." "What if I'd sent you back anyway, storm or no storm?" She'd thought about this. She had thought about it on the stagecoach, and before the stagecoach, and in every uncertain night since. "Then I'd have figured out the next thing," she said. "I always figure out the next thing. I don't have the option of not figuring out the next thing." Something moved through Jacob's expression. Something she might have called respect if she'd been willing to name it that quickly, which she wasn't. He looked at his hands on the table. He had the hands of a man who worked with them constantly, large, practical, scarred in several places from the ordinary violence of ranch life. "She laughed today," he said, "when Danny made that face." Hannah smiled. "She laughs every time. I think she finds him genuinely funny." "She has good taste," Jacob said, and that was definitely a dry joke delivered with such understatement that it took her a half-second to catch it. And when she did, she laughed, and he looked up, and for the first time, the very first time, she saw him smile. Not a full one, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of one. "Go get some sleep," he said, standing up. "You've been up since before 4. "You counted? The kitchen was warm when I came in at 4:15, he said. Somebody had already been in it. He walked to the door. He paused the way he always paused, and then he said without turning back, "She's lucky, Emma." "Why?" Hannah asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you kept your promise," he said, and then he walked out, and she heard his footsteps go down the hall, and the quiet sound of his office door, and Hannah sat at the table alone in the warm kitchen for a long time after that, not moving, not reaching for the next task or the next thing that needed doing, just sitting in the particular silence of a moment that has said something real and left it on the table, where you can look at it and understand that some things once spoken changed the shape of the air they were spoken in. Outside, the Wyoming night was wide and dark and full of stars. Inside, the kitchen held its warmth like something worth protecting. And Hannah Brooks, who had arrived with a carpet bag and a baby and a promise she'd made to a dying woman, sat in Jacob Walker's kitchen and understood with the careful precision of a woman who had learned not to trust easy things that something here was becoming something. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but she was for the first time in 3 weeks not afraid of finding out. The first snow came on a Monday. Hannah knew it before she saw it, felt it in the particular quality of the silence that settled over the ranch in the early hours. The way sound behaves differently when the world outside has gone white and muffled, and the air has taken on that specific held breath quality that means everything is about to change. She was already at the stove when she heard it, the absence of wind that was somehow louder than wind, and she went to the kitchen window and looked out and saw it coming down in the thick, purposeful way of a storm that has made a decision and intends to follow through. She put another log in the stove and started the coffee and did not wake anyone. By breakfast, the ranch was operating under the particular controlled urgency of men who know exactly what early snow means and have no interest in discussing it. Just movement. Just the efficient language of people with too much to do and not enough time to do it. Jacob was already out before first light. Hector ate standing up. Pete and Cal finished their biscuits in 4 minutes and were pulling on their heaviest coats before Hannah had set out the second pot of coffee, and Roy and Danny were already halfway to the barn. "How bad?" Hannah asked Hector as he was leaving. "Got cattle in the north pasture," he said. "Need to move them before the drifts close the pass. If Walker doesn't get them through today..." He stopped. He pulled his collar up. "It'll be a hard winter, even if everything goes right," he said. "And things don't always go right." He went out, and the kitchen was suddenly very quiet, except for Emma pulling herself up on the rail of her box and looking at the closed door with an expression of profound interest. "I know," Hannah told her. "A lot happening." Emma sat back down and picked up her rabbit. The men came back in waves throughout the day, cold, brief, hungry, and Hannah kept food on the stove continuously, the kind of cooking that doesn't stop, hot soup that she refreshed every hour. Biscuits in rotating batches, coffee that was never empty and never cold. She did not sit down. She did not stop moving. Emma slept her midday nap and woke and played and ate and watched, and Hannah moved around her in the practiced orbit of a woman who has learned to accomplish complicated things in the same space as a small child without either one getting in the other's way. By 3 o'clock, she knew something was wrong. The men came back without Jacob. Hector's face when he came through the door was the face of a man managing something carefully. He was managing his expression, managing his voice, managing the amount of information he released, because he understood that an unmanaged piece of information can do as much damage as the thing itself. "Where is he?" Hannah said. She wasn't asking to be told he was fine. She already knew from Hector's face that fine was not the current situation. "He got the cattle through the pass," Hector said. "All of them. Every head." He sat down and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she'd put in front of him. "He was behind us on the way back. When we got to the barn, he wasn't..." He stopped. Pete went back out, found him about a quarter-mile from the barn. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout. Hannah had already crossed to the door before Hector finished the sentence. She had her coat on before he got to the next word. "He's coming," Hector said quickly. "Pete's got him. He's walking. He's..." The door opened. Pete came through first, and then Jacob and Hannah understood immediately the difference between walking and walking. Jacob Walker was upright and moving, but everything else about him said that upright was costing him considerably. His lips were the particular pale blue color of a man whose body has stopped prioritizing the extremities. He was moving with the slightly disconnected quality of someone whose mind and body are no longer in full communication. "Sit," Hannah said. "I'm fine," Jacob said. And the fact that his voice was slightly slower than usual gave away the lie with more efficiency than any argument could. "You are not fine," Hannah said with the calm directness of a woman who does not have time for the particular brand of stubbornness that convinces men they are warmer than they are. "Sit down, Mr. Walker." He sat down. She was already moving coat off the back of the door. Not his coat, which was soaked and frozen at the edges, but the heavy wool blanket from the chest in the hallway, the one she'd identified in her first week as the warmest thing on the property. She put it around his shoulders. She pushed the chair closer to the stove. "Boots," she said. "Hannah, your boots are wet through and you cannot warm from the feet up if your feet are sitting in frozen leather." She crouched down before he could object further and began working the laces herself with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has simply decided that the argument isn't happening. "Hector, the pot on the back burner, there's broth. Pour it in the blue cup, not the tin one. The tin one will be too hot to hold." Hector was already moving. Pete stood near the door, looking simultaneously relieved and slightly overwhelmed. Cal appeared behind him, and then Roy and Danny crowded into the kitchen doorway, the whole lot of them taking up space and radiating the particular worried but trying not to show it energy of men who care about someone and have no good language for it. "You all have dry clothes," Hannah said without looking up from the boots. "Yes, ma'am," Cal said. "Then go put them on and come back for supper. I'll have it on in an hour." They went. She heard them go, heard the bunkhouse door, heard the silence reassert itself in the kitchen, and then there was just Jacob and Hector and Emma watching from her box with the focused attention of someone observing something important. Hector set the blue cup on the table within Jacob's reach and looked at Hannah and said quietly, "I'll be in the bunkhouse," and left and pulled the door most of the way closed behind him. And Hannah understood this as the gift it was. She got the second boot off. She set both of them near the stove where they would dry. She found the pair of dry wool socks she'd seen in the basket near the hallway. She had learned the geography of this house in the way that people learn things they intend to be responsible for and put them in his hands. "Can you manage?" she asked. "I've been managing things since I was 23. He said, but there was no edge in it, and he took the socks. She turned back to the stove and gave him the privacy of not being watched while he managed. And when she turned back, he had the socks on and both hands around the blue cup, and he was drinking the broth in the careful sips of someone whose body is reminding itself how to feel warm. She sat down across from him. Not the far end of the table across from him, close enough that she could see his color and judge for herself whether it was coming back. It was slowly. "All the cattle?" she asked. "All of them," he said. "Every head." Hector said the pass would have closed by evening. It would have. She looked at him. He looked back at her. They both understood what that meant. The cattle that got through today were the difference between a hard winter and a ruinous one, were the difference between this ranch surviving until spring in a condition that could be rebuilt from and surviving it in a condition that couldn't. "You could have sent someone else back for the last group," she said. "No," he said simply. "I couldn't have." She understood that too. She didn't agree with it exactly, but she understood it, the particular code of a man who leads from the front because he believes that's the only honest way to lead, who will not ask another person to take a risk. He isn't willing to take himself. She understood it because she had her own version of the same thing, had carried Emma across 2 states on the same principle. "You scared me," she said. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, and she felt them land in the space between them, with a weight she hadn't entirely intended, and she watched Jacob's face do something complicated with that, absorb it, turn it over, look at it from a direction he hadn't expected. "Did I?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Hannah said. She did not soften it or take it back. It was true, and she'd said it, and the truth was the truth. He looked at the cup in his hands. His color was coming back properly now, the blue pale replaced by something closer to the real color of his face, and when he looked up again, he looked more like himself, focused and contained, and carrying his interior life in the careful way he always carried it. "I'm sorry," he said. She hadn't expected that. An apology from Jacob Walker offered simply without deflection or qualification was not something she'd seen before, and it sat her back slightly, because it was so entirely genuine. "Just don't do it again," she said, which was not what she had planned to say either, and which came out with rather more feeling than she intended. Jacob looked at her, and then quietly he said, "I'll try." Emma chose this exact moment to throw her rabbit out of the box. The rabbit landed on the kitchen floor 3 feet away, and Emma looked at it with great seriousness, and then looked at Jacob and said, "Bah," which was her word for most things, but which in this context had the quality of a pronouncement. Jacob looked at the rabbit on the floor. He looked at Emma. He got up, moving more steadily now, the warmth coming back into his limbs, and he crossed the kitchen, and he bent down and picked up the rabbit, and he brought it back to Emma, and he placed it in her outstretched hands. Emma grabbed his finger. She grabbed it the way babies grab things, without strategy, without consideration, just the pure reflex of a small hand finding something solid and holding on. And Jacob went very still. Hannah watched him look down at Emma's hand around his finger. She watched his face do something that was not quite any one emotion, but was several of them at once layered, the way geological things are layered, the old and the recent and the raw, all present at the same time. Emma held on for a long moment. Then she let go and went back to her rabbit, satisfied, as though she had accomplished exactly what she intended. Jacob straightened up slowly. He did not say anything. He walked back to his chair and sat down and picked up the blue cup and finished the broth, and Hannah went back to making supper, and neither of them mentioned it. But something had shifted. Something that had been standing at a careful distance had taken one step closer, and both of them knew it, and neither of them knew exactly what to do with it yet. That was all right. Some things take the time they take. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of snow that moved in shifts heavy and blinding for hours, then letting up to a sullen gray sifting, then building again, as though it had reconsidered its approach, and decided on a different angle of attack. The road to Sheridan became, by the second day, theoretical. The pass to the north pasture was confirmed closed by Hector, who went to look at it, and came back with the expression of a man who has seen enough Wyoming winters to know when a thing is simply done until spring decides otherwise. They were in it now, all of them together in a house that had not held this many people in continuous proximity for as long as any of them could remember. On the first day of the storm proper, Jacob stayed inside. This was notable. Hannah had been on the ranch long enough to understand that Jacob Walker was not a man who stayed inside willingly. He used the outside, the way some people use sleep, as a way of resetting himself, and the idea of being confined to the walls of his own house for reasons beyond his control had a visible effect on him by late afternoon. He moved through the main room and the hallway and the kitchen with the contained, slightly too careful energy of a man who is working very hard at not being restless. He ended up in the kitchen. Not dramatically, there was no moment of decision, no announcement. He simply drifted there the way water finds its lowest point, and sat down at the table with the account books he'd brought from his office, and Hannah went on cooking, and Emma went on doing whatever Emma did, and the three of them occupied the warm kitchen together, in a way that should have been awkward and was somehow not. "You don't have to stay in here," Hannah said, not unkindly, after about 20 minutes. "The office is cold," Jacob said without looking up. "I can bring wood." "The kitchen's warm," he said, "if you don't mind." She didn't mind. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she didn't mind at all. He worked on the accounts. She cooked. Emma pulled herself to standing on the rail of her box, something she'd started doing with increasing confidence over the past week, and then sat back down, and then stood up again, working through the mechanics of upright, with the focused determination that babies bring to all physical problems, which is to say, absolute and tireless and impervious to failure. "She's going to walk soon," Jacob said. Hannah looked up. He was watching Emma over the top of the account book with an expression that he probably thought was neutral. "Probably," Hannah said. "Another month, maybe. She's been practicing." "Practicing," he said. "Watch." They both watched. Emma stood up holding the rail, and then for the first time Hannah had seen she let go. Just for a second, just long enough to be terrifying and triumphant, before she grabbed the rail again and looked extremely pleased with herself. Jacob set down the account book. Did she just... Yes, Hannah said. She was smiling so hard it almost hurt. She just did. Emma looked at both of them with the exact expression of a person who has done something remarkable and is waiting for confirmation of this fact. And Jacob said in a voice that was quieter and less contained than his usual voice, "Well, I'll be..." And Emma, apparently satisfied with this response, sat back down and picked up her rabbit. Hannah looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at Hannah. "Don't tell Danny," he said. "He'll be insufferable about missing it." Hannah laughed. He almost smiled, and the storm threw itself against the windows and didn't matter at all. The second evening of the storm was when the real conversation happened. It began as real conversations sometimes do with something small. She was mending one of his shirts. She'd found a pile of them in the hallway basket, worn through at the elbows in 2 cases and missing buttons in 3 others. The particular accumulated neglect of a man who handles practical problems immediately and personal ones never. And he was reading or pretending to read near the stove, and Emma was asleep in the small room, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. And then Jacob said out of nothing, "Tell me about her." Hannah's hands went still on the shirt. "Emma? Your sister." She hadn't expected that. She looked up. He was looking at the book but not reading it. "You don't have to," he said. He paused. "I know it was recent. The Hector's medicine situation told me the cough was recent, but you being her guardian, that was before you got here." "Yes," Hannah said. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about what it cost to say the things she hadn't said out loud since the grave in Kansas, and she thought about what it meant that Jacob was asking, what it meant that Jacob, who kept his own interior life in a locked room and handed out the key to no one, was asking. "Her name was Clara," Hannah said. "She was 22, 4 years younger than me." She kept mending while she talked. It was easier that way. "She was the beautiful one," Hannah said. "The one people noticed when she walked into a room. I was always the practical one, the capable one, the one who made sure things ran. Clara was the one who made things worth running." She paused. "She got sick in the spring. We thought it was just the usual something going around, but it wasn't." Jacob had set the book down. He was listening the way he did everything fully and without interruption. "Emma's father left before Emma was born," Hannah said, and said it flatly, the way you say a thing that has been incorporated into the structure of your understanding and no longer requires editorial comment. "Clara was alone. I came to help when she got sick and I stayed, and at the end Hannah's hand slowed. She made herself keep moving the needle. She asked me to promise, and I promised." "Without hesitating," Jacob said. Hannah looked up. He said it as a statement, not a question, and he was right. "Without hesitating," she confirmed. "Did you know what it would cost you?" She thought about that honestly. "I knew it would cost something. I didn't know exactly what. You never know exactly what a promise is going to cost until you're in the middle of paying it." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, you don't." And she understood that he wasn't only talking about her promise. This was the door opening. This was Jacob Walker, who had kept the door of his interior life sealed for 12 years, putting his hand on it. She kept her voice gentle. "What did yours cost you?" He looked at the fire. He was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps she'd pushed too far, moved too fast, and she was preparing to let it go gracefully when he said, "I'd started to make plans. Before the fever year. There was a woman, in Cheyenne, and I had plans." He stopped. "After I couldn't figure out how to want things without being afraid of losing them, so I stopped wanting things." The honesty of it was so direct and so unguarded that it sat the breath right out of her. "That's a long time to not want things," she said. 12 years? He said. And now, he looked at her. The firelight was doing something to the room, making everything closer and warmer and more honest than rooms usually managed. and Jacob Walker looked at her across it with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something open, something that hadn't been there a month ago, when she'd stood in the yard with her carpet bag, and he'd looked at her like a problem he needed to solve. And now, he said slowly, I find I've started wanting things again, without exactly deciding to. Hannah held very still. That scares me, he said, in case you were wondering. I know, she said. It scares me too. They looked at each other across the warm kitchen with the storm outside, and Emma asleep in the next room, and the shirt half mended in Hannah's hands. And it was not a declaration, and it was not a resolution, and it was not the end of anything, or the clean beginning of anything. But it was true, and it was between them now, and neither one of them was going to be able to pretend it wasn't. Jacob picked up his book. Hannah went back to the shirt. But the room was different than it had been an hour ago, and they both knew it, and neither of them said another word about it that night, because neither of them needed to. The third day of the storm was when everything almost fell apart. The message came by way of a rider who should not have been out in that weather, and clearly knew it, a young man from Sheridan who arrived at the ranch door with the look of someone who has done a stupid thing for an important reason and is hoping the importance justifies the stupidity. He had a letter. The letter was for Hannah. She knew something was wrong before she opened it, because the handwriting on the outside was a lawyer's handwriting, formal and deliberate, and the kind of penmanship that people develop when they spend their lives writing things that will be contested. She opened it at the kitchen table while Jacob was in the barn, and Emma was asleep. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a long moment, and looked at the window where the snow was still coming, and thought about Clara, and thought about the promises you make, without knowing what they will cost, and thought about the particular cruelty of certain kinds of timing. Hector found her there 10 minutes later. What is it? He said. She handed him the letter. He read it. His expression, which was generally a reliable instrument, shifted through several things. Surprise, then anger, then the careful neutrality of a man containing the anger, because anger right now would not be useful. Clara's baby, Hannah said. A family in Abilene. They're claiming Emma's father left property when he died. Land. Enough land to matter. And they're saying Emma is the legal heir and they want... She stopped. She picked up the letter again. She forced herself to read the relevant section out loud in a steady voice, because a steady voice was what the situation required. They are requesting that Emma Brooks be delivered to their custody in Abilene by no later than January 1st, as the child's closest surviving paternal relations and as her legal guardians under the laws of... She stopped again. Hector sat down. I'm her guardian, Hannah said. Clara named me, in writing, before witnesses. A maternal aunt, Hector said, not challenging her, just thinking through it. But if there's property involved, a maternal aunt without resources suddenly looks a great deal less compelling to a judge than a paternal family with means and a land claim, Hannah said. The steadiness in her voice cost her. She could feel exactly what it was costing. They have a lawyer. They have a claim. And I have... She looked at the letter. I have a document signed by a dying woman in a rented room in Kansas. When did he die? Hector asked. The father. August, apparently. Clara didn't know. If she'd known, if Emma had known. She stopped, started over. If someone had told us about the land, we could have filed for Emma's inheritance before anyone else positioned themselves. But nobody told you. No, nobody told us. She folded the letter carefully. Because if Emma has the land, she doesn't need the family in Abilene to manage it. And they know that. Hector was quiet for a moment. You need to tell Walker, he said. She knew that. She had been sitting here working up to it because telling Jacob meant asking Jacob for something she hadn't asked anyone for in as long as she could remember, which was help. Which was the specific kind of help that required trusting that the person you asked had enough regard for you to give it without using it against you later. She had not trusted anyone with that kind of ask in a very long time. The barn door. His boots in the hall. And then Jacob came through the kitchen door, and he looked at Hector's face, and then at Hannah's face, and then at the folded letter on the table, and he said, "What happened?" She told him. She told him all of it clearly and quickly, and without dramatizing any of it, because he was a man who dealt best with facts presented straight. And she respected that. And also because she had just spent 3 weeks learning that Jacob Walker responded to trust with trust. And she intended to stake everything on that being true right now. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hector, get Danny. He used to clerk in a law office before he came west." Hector was already standing. "And get the good lantern," Jacob added. "We're going to need light for reading." He sat down across from Hannah. He looked at her directly, with the full weight of the attention she had come to understand was one of the most real things about him. "You have Clara's document," he said. "The guardianship." "In my bag. I've had it since the day she yes, I have it." "Then we start there," he said. "And we figure out the rest." She looked at him. "Jacob, this isn't your problem." He held her gaze for a steady moment, and in that moment something shifted in his face. Something settled, some decision became final, and he said quietly, and with complete certainty, "Hannah, yes it is." She felt the words go through her, the way warmth goes through a person who has been very cold for a very long time, not all at once, but spreading, reaching places she'd forgotten existed. She looked down at the letter. "All right," she said. "Then let's start. Danny, it turned out, had clerked in a law office in Missouri for 3 years, before deciding that the West suited him better than depositions, and his face, when he read the Abilene letter, went through a rapid professional assessment that reminded Hannah that people were frequently more than their daily surfaces suggested. "Guardianship document is solid," he said, "provided it was witnessed properly." "2 witnesses," Hannah said. "Both signed, the doctor and the landlady." "Names, Dr. Thomas Alcott and Mrs. Pearl Hennessy, Wichita, Kansas." Danny wrote them down. "Either of them reachable? The doctor certainly. Mrs. Hennessy runs her boarding house year-round." Danny looked at Jacob. "We write to both of them. Affidavit confirming they witnessed the document in sound mind and proper form. We file that with the county court in Kansas before the Abilene claim gets established." He tapped the letter. "This family, they've got a lawyer, but they haven't filed yet. This letter is a pressure tactic. They're hoping she'll panic and comply without forcing them to go to court." "They picked the wrong woman," Hector said. Hannah was not sure she'd ever loved Hector more than in that exact moment. "Can they win?" Jacob said. "In court, if it comes to that." Danny considered this with the honest care of someone who had learned that false optimism in legal matters costs more than the initial discomfort of truth. A paternal family with land and means versus a single woman with a handwritten document, it depends on the judge. In some counties that goes one way, in some it goes another. He paused. It'd be a stronger case if Hannah had more stability, more establishment, more... He seemed to search for the right word. "More standing," Jacob said. "Yes," Danny said. "More standing." The kitchen was very quiet. Jacob looked at the table. He looked at Danny. He looked at Hector, who had the carefully neutral expression of a man who has an opinion and is not going to say it. He looked at Hannah. She was looking at the letter in Danny's hands, and she was not going to say the thing that was in the room because it was not her thing to say. Because some things a person has to arrive at themselves, and if you pull them there before they're ready, the ground doesn't hold. And she knew that she had always known that, and she would not take that choice away from him regardless of what it cost her. She would find another way. She always found another way. "Hannah," Jacob said. She looked up. His face was doing the thing it had done the night he'd said, "Because you kept your promise," that layered geological thing, the old and the present and the true, all visible at once. "I know this isn't the conversation we..." He stopped, started over because Jacob Walker was a man who, when he started something, finished it. "I know the timing is wrong. I know this is not how..." He looked at his hands on the table and then back at her. "But I want to do this right. And I want to ask you properly, not because of the legal situation, but because I've been sitting with something for 3 weeks, and this situation just made me realize that sitting with it wasn't something I could afford to keep doing. Hannah's heart was doing something complicated. I'm not a man who says things easily, Jacob said. You've noticed that. I've noticed, she said. So when I say something, I mean it completely. He held her gaze. I want you to stay, Hannah. Not for the ranch, not for the cooking, not because of what Danny just said about standing, though I understand what it would mean practically. His voice was steady. I want you to stay because this house makes sense when you're in it in a way that it hasn't made sense in 12 years. I want you to stay because Emma let go of that rail today, and I've never wanted to see something happen more in my life than I want to see her walk across this kitchen floor. And I want you to stay because I haven't been afraid of losing something in 12 years, and I've been afraid of losing you for 3 weeks, and I know what that means. The room was so quiet that the snow outside was audible, that faint, constant hush of it against the window. Jacob, Hannah said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Are you asking me to marry you? He looked at her. I'm asking if you'd consider it, he said. I'm asking badly. I know I'm asking badly, but I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Clara. She thought about Wichita and Abilene and 12 miles of Wyoming road and a carpetbag and a baby and a promise and a storm and a man who had put firewood beside the door every cold morning without once being asked. She thought about the blue cup, the honey jar, the moment in the yard with Tom Crawford when he'd closed the door without hesitating. She thought about last night, and I find I've started wanting things again, and it scares me too. You're not asking badly, she said. He waited. Yes, Hannah said. I'll consider it. Something happened in Jacob Walker's face that she had not seen there before, something that was purely and simply relief. The specific relief of a man who has said the most important thing he's ever said and found that the person on the other side received it. Hector made a sound that was not quite a cough. Danny was looking very intently at the letter in his hands. We'll, Hector said with tremendous dignity, write those letters in the morning. Yes, Jacob said, not looking away from Hannah. We will. Outside, the storm moved on into the night, still heavy, still certain of itself, but somehow less consequential than it had been an hour ago. The kitchen held its warmth. Emma slept in the next room, unknowing and trusted and safe, while two people on opposite sides of a kitchen table looked at each other and understood that some things arrive without warning and matter entirely, and that the only reasonable response to that kind of arrival is to open the door and let them in. The letters went out the next morning. Danny wrote them because Danny had the legal language and the handwriting that courts took seriously, and he wrote them at the kitchen table before breakfast with the focused efficiency of a man who has found the thing he is specifically useful for and intends to be very useful indeed. 2 letters, one to Dr. Thomas Alcott, one to Mrs. Pearl. Hennessy, requesting sworn affidavits confirming their witness to Clara Brooks's guardianship document, signed and sealed and notarized if possible, returned by the fastest available post to the Walker Ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Jacob added a 3rd letter. He wrote it himself in his own hand, which was not the elegant penmanship of a clerk, but was precise and unambiguous in the way that Jacob Walker was precise and unambiguous in everything he did. He wrote to a lawyer in Cheyenne named Aldous Prentice, who had handled the ranch's land documentation 3 years prior, and who Jacob described simply as a man who knew how things actually worked, which Hannah understood to mean a man who understood that the law and justice were not always the same territory, and knew how to navigate the distance between them. He did not show Hannah the letter before he sealed it. He showed her after. She read it. Then she read it again. He had written, among other things, that he was writing on behalf of his intended wife and her ward, and that the matter was urgent, and that money was not the obstacle. She looked up from the letter. Your intended wife, she said. You said you'd consider it, Jacob said. He was looking at her with that steady, careful attention of his. I'm considering it considered. That's not quite how considering works. I know how it works, he said. I'm optimistic. She handed the letter back to him. She turned back to the stove. And she did not let him see the smile because it was too large, and she had not yet figured out what to do with it. The storm broke on the fourth day, as Wyoming storms do not gradually, not apologetically, but all at once, as though it had simply finished whatever it came to do and moved on without ceremony. The sky went from white to the particular hard blue of winter clarity, and the world outside reassembled itself from the shapeless white into actual geography again, and the men started moving. The first order of business was the north pasture fence, which the storm had finished what it had started. Jacob took Pete and Cal and Roy out to survey it, and Danny stayed back to help Hector with the barn, and Hannah sent them all out with biscuits wrapped in cloth, and the understanding that lunch would be ready at noon, regardless of where the work stood. The ranch resumed its rhythm, but it was a different rhythm than the one she'd arrived into 6 weeks ago. She felt the difference in small ways, the way the men moved through the kitchen, now comfortable and without ceremony. The way Hector said good morning to Emma before he said it to anyone else. The way Roy had taken to leaving small carved items on the kitchen work table without comment. A rabbit last week, a small horse the week before, and this morning a tiny cradle no bigger than Hannah's palm that she picked up and turned over in her hands for a long time, before setting it carefully on the shelf above the stove where she could see it. Roy walked in for his second cup of coffee, saw her looking at the shelf, and said nothing, which was Roy's way of saying everything. "Thank you, Roy," Hannah said. Roy poured his coffee and left. She understood this place now. She understood its particular language, the way it communicated through action, and through silence, and through the things that appeared without explanation, and the things that were fixed without being asked. She understood that this was how love operated in a place like this, not in declarations, not in flowery expressions, but in split firewood and carved toys and letters written to lawyers in Cheyenne at 5 in the morning before the rest of the house woke up. She was thinking about this, about language and love, and the different shapes they took when Emma pulled herself to standing on the kitchen chair, let go with both hands, stood completely unsupported for 4 full seconds, and then sat down hard on the floor and looked up at Hannah with enormous, surprised eyes. Hannah crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and crouched down. "Are you all right?" Emma considered the question. She was clearly not hurt. She was, if anything, impressed with herself. She grabbed Hannah's hands and used them to pull herself back to standing, and then, and this was the part that stopped Hannah's breath completely, she took 1 step. 1 deliberate, wobbling, magnificent step, still holding Hannah's hands, and then another. And her face was the face of someone who has just discovered that they are capable of something they were not capable of yesterday, and the world is therefore entirely different than it was. "Oh," Hannah said. "Oh, Emma." She was crying before she knew she was going to cry, which happens sometimes with the big things, the things that don't announce themselves as big until they're happening. Emma looked up at her with concern, and then patted Hannah's cheek with 1 unsteady hand, the way she'd started doing recently when she wanted to communicate something that she didn't yet have words for. "I know," Hannah told her. "I know, sweetheart." She was still there on the kitchen floor, Emma standing between her hands when the back door opened, and Jacob came in early ahead of the others, for a reason she didn't know, and stopped. He looked at them. He looked at Emma standing between Hannah's hands, with her uncertain new legs, and her enormous proud eyes, and her hand still resting on Hannah's wet cheek. He looked at Hannah's face. "She walked," Hannah said. Jacob crouched down on the other side of Emma, and Emma turned toward him, with the swiveling focus of someone who has just discovered they can choose their direction, and she let go of Hannah's left hand and reached for Jacob instead, and walked 2 steps, then 3, then a 4th, before her legs gave the whole project up as too ambitious, and she sat down again, walked from Hannah directly to Jacob. He caught her when she sat. He had his hands ready without thinking about it, positioned to catch her exactly where she fell, and he held her, and she grabbed his collar and looked up at him with the satisfaction of mission accomplished. Jacob looked down at Emma in his hands. He looked like a man who has been broken open by something he didn't see coming. He looked like a man who has not held something this small and this trusting in a very long time, possibly ever, and who has discovered that the holding of it has rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of who he is. 4 steps, Hannah said quietly. I counted, Jacob said, and his voice was not entirely his usual voice. He cleared it. He looked up at Hannah, and she was still on the floor across from him, and Emma was between them. And she would think about this moment for the rest of her life. This was the moment when she understood with complete certainty that she had not made a mistake. Jacob, she said. Yes, he said. I'm done considering. He went completely still. Yes, she said again. My answer is yes. Emma said bah firmly and with conviction, as though she'd been waiting for someone to reach this conclusion, and was pleased that it had finally happened. Jacob looked at Hannah for a long moment, with that face she had come to understand carried more in it than most people's faces managed in a lifetime, and then he said very quietly, All right. It was not a particularly romantic response. He would admit this later. He would say with the dry understatement that she was learning to love specifically, that he had not prepared a speech because he had not known when the moment would arrive, and Hannah would say that she did not require a speech, and he would say, Good, because he was not a speech man, and she would say, I know that's one of the things I like about you. And he would look at her in the way he looked at her when she said something that he needed a moment to absorb, and that would be enough. It would always be enough. It was more than enough. But that was later. Right now he said all right, and she said all right back, and Emma said bah again, and Jacob stood up with the baby against his shoulder and helped Hannah to her feet with his free hand, and held her hand for a moment after she was standing. And that was the engagement of Jacob Walker and Hannah Brooks in the winter of 1889, witnessed only by a baby taking her first steps and the warm walls of a kitchen that had been waiting for exactly this for longer than anyone knew. The letters came back faster than Danny had predicted. Dr. Alcott's arrived first 11 days after they'd sent out, which meant he had written back within 48 hours of receiving theirs, which told Hannah something about the kind of man he was. The affidavit was thorough and precisely worded and notarized with the stamp of the Wichita County Court, and when Danny read it, he nodded with the slow satisfaction of a man watching legal architecture come together the way it should. Mrs. Hennessy's came 3 days later, and hers was less formally written, but no less powerful. 4 handwritten pages, from a woman who had clearly decided that if she was going to speak on Clara Brooks's behalf, she was going to say everything she knew, which included the date and time and precise circumstances of the signing, the names of everyone present, a description of Clara's mental clarity and the steadiness of her voice when she made Hannah promise to take care of Emma, and 3 paragraphs about Hannah herself that made Hannah have to leave the kitchen for a moment to collect herself before she could continue reading. She came back in and sat down and said, She said Clara told her I was the most reliable person she'd ever met. She was right, Hector said with the simplicity of a man stating a fact. Jacob was reading the Hennessy letter. He set it down and looked at Hannah. We have everything we need, he said. Danny was already nodding. Combined with Prentice's response from Cheyenne, he held up a 3rd letter that had arrived in the same post as Mrs. Hennessy's. Which, by the way, is not a gentle document, Walker. Your lawyer in Cheyenne writes like a man who has won arguments professionally and has opinions about people who use legal letters to pressure grieving women. Good, Jacob said. He suggests filing preemptively in the Kansas court to establish the guardianship before the Abilene family can establish standing there. He says if we move fast, their claim becomes significantly more complicated to pursue, and... Danny paused reading. He says, and I quote, that they have most likely sent this letter to several women in similar situations, and found that the majority comply without requiring them to actually go to court. He looked up. This is a tactic. They're land brokers, not family. The kitchen went quiet in the way it went quiet when something ugly had been named, and everyone in the room was having the same response to it. Emma's land, Hannah said. It came out harder than she intended. Clara's daughter's land. They want it managed by people who can profit from it before she's old enough to claim it herself. That's about the shape of it, Danny said. Jacob stood up. When Jacob Walker stood up in the middle of a conversation, Hannah had learned it meant a decision had been made, and the execution of it was now in progress. Write to Prentice. Tell him to file. Tell him I'll cover the costs, and I want it done before the end of January. Jacob, Hannah said. That's Emma's land, he said. Which means it's her future, which means it matters. He looked at Hannah steadily. Do you have an objection? She thought about objecting. She thought about the particular pride of a woman who has always handled her own problems, and the instinct to say, I can manage, I'll find a way, you don't need to do this. She thought about what Hector had told her in the first week for him, that means considerable. She thought about what it meant that Jacob Walker, who kept everything at arm's length, kept nothing at arm's length when it came to her and Emma. No, she said, no objection. He nodded. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. Then it's done, he said, and moved on to the next thing, the way practical men move on to the next thing. And Hannah watched him do it, and understood that this movement, this decision, this absolute certainty about where he stood, was what love looked like in the particular language of Jacob Walker, and it was, she thought, one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. Christmas came to the Walker Ranch like it had heard what was happening there and wanted to be part of it. Hannah could not have explained exactly when the preparations began, because they grew organically from the rhythm of the weeks before them. Pete and Cal dragging a pine tree in from the North Ridge and spending an afternoon arguing amiably about where it should stand. Roy producing a collection of carved ornaments from some private reserve that no one had known existed. Danny contributing a considerable length of red ribbon that he claimed to have purchased in Sheridan before the first storm, and which Hector claimed Danny had been hoarding specifically for this purpose. I was not hoarding, Danny said. You put it under your bunk, Cal said. For safekeeping. From who? From people who would use it irresponsibly, Danny said with great dignity, and tied a bow on the pine branch with such precision that no one could argue further. Hannah made 3 kinds of pie because she had discovered that the way to make a large group of people feel genuinely celebrated, rather than generically fed, was to make the exact thing each person loved best, and she had spent 6 weeks learning exactly that. She made apple for Hector, who had mentioned once in passing that his mother had grown apples in Indiana. She made pecan for Danny, who went quiet in a particular way whenever pecans appeared in anything the way people go quiet around things that remind them of somewhere specific. She made a simple custard for Roy, who she had deduced from careful observation over 6 weeks preferred things that were not elaborate that tasted like what they were, without pretending to be anything else. She made a 4th pie for Jacob. She made it from dried cherries she'd been storing since October, combined with the last of the sugar and a butter crust that she worked until it was right, and then worked some more until it was perfect, because she wanted it to be perfect, and she did not have a rational explanation for that, beyond the obvious one, which was that she was making something for someone she loved, and love has a way of making your hands more careful. She was finishing the crust when Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway on Christmas Eve, and she looked up at him, and he was not looking at the pie. He was looking at her. Come see something, he said. I have to. Hannah, he said. Come see something. She put down the pastry brush. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him down the hallway to the main room, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at what he'd put there. It was a cradle, not Roy's small carved one from the kitchen shelf. A real cradle full-sized made from polished pine wood that caught the firelight and held it built with the kind of attention to joinery that meant someone had spent a great deal of time making sure it would last. The rockers were curved perfectly. The sides were smooth as river stones. Along the headboard worked into the wood in careful patient relief were small flowers, the kind of detail that doesn't happen quickly, that requires choosing to sit with a piece of wood and a carving tool for many evenings, and make something that didn't have to be beautiful and be beautiful anyway. Hannah stood in the doorway and looked at it. Jacob, she said. It needed something, he said. She's been in that box since you got here. You built this. I had evenings. She looked at him. He was standing beside it with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has done something and is not sure how it will be received, and has decided that the uncertainty is worth the risk. "Those flowers," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother had flowers like that on a shelf in the kitchen when I was small. I don't—" He stopped. "I thought Emma might like them." Hannah pressed her hand to her mouth briefly. She was not going to cry in front of him if she could help it, and she could not entirely help it, so she comprised on one quick moment of it, and then brought herself back. "Jacob Walker," she said. "Hannah Brooks," he said. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." He looked at the cradle. He looked at her. "It's for Emma," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why." He understood that. She saw him understand it, the particular comprehension of a man who has spent 12 years believing that caring for something was too dangerous, and has just encountered proof that it is in fact the only thing worth doing. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the night of the storm, since the kitchen floor, since the day she'd said yes, with the specific quality of a man who has identified something true and intends to remain in its vicinity for the foreseeable future. He took her hand. Not dramatically, he just took it, held it in both of his, the way he'd held the blue cup when he was cold, with the same careful completeness as though her hand was something worth warming, and he was prepared to take his time about it. "Merry Christmas, Hannah," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. They stood there in the main room with the pine tree and the red ribbon and the polished cradle in the firelight, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and inside this house there was warmth enough for all of it. Christmas morning arrived with the quality of a day that has decided to be good before anyone woke up to confirm it. Hannah was at the stove at 4, the way she always was, but the mood in the kitchen was different, lighter, quicker, like the air itself had more space in it. Emma woke at 5 and was immediately interested in everything which at 10 months old now meant pulling herself along furniture with increasing confidence, and examining all objects at floor level with the focused intensity of a scientist at work. The men came in from the bunkhouse in various states of cheerfulness and were immediately deployed by Hannah Danny to carry dishes, Cal to set the table, Pete to manage the coffee, Roy to simply exist somewhere that wasn't in front of the stove, which he did with the cooperative ease of a man who understands his limitations and respects them. Hector came in. Last looked at the table, looked at the 3 pies visible on the counter, and said, "Is that apple?" with the voice of a man addressing something sacred. "It's apple," Hannah said. Hector sat down with the reverence of a man in church. Jacob came in and looked at the full table and the decorated room, and his men arranged around it, talking and laughing and arguing about something meaningless, the way people argue when they are comfortable. And his eyes found Hannah at the stove, and she looked up, and they held that for a moment. Just that, just a look, just the particular communication of 2 people who understand each other. And then the moment ended, and breakfast was served, and the table was loud with it. It was, Danny declared afterward, the best Christmas he'd had since he was 12, which was the age at which the world had generally gotten more complicated for Danny, as it did for most people at that age. Though he didn't specify further, and nobody asked. "Best meal I've had, period," Cal said. "You say that every meal," Pete said. "I mean it, every meal," Cal said. "I'm a consistent person." Roy ate 2 pieces of custard pie and said nothing, and meant more by the nothing than most people said with words. Hector, finishing his apple pie, looked around the table with the expression of a man taking inventory of something valuable. "You know what this ranch needed," he said to no one in particular. "Don't," Jacob said. "A cook?" Hector said. "It needed a cook. I'm just saying." "Hector, I'm saying it anyway." He picked up his coffee. "Best thing that ever happened to this ranch was a storm that closed the road to Sheridan." He looked at Hannah with the directness of a man who has decided that if something is true, it ought to be said. Best thing. The table was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Hector," Hannah said. "Yes, ma'am," Hector said. "Now, is there more pie?" There was more pie. The second twist arrived 11 days after Christmas, and it arrived without warning, the way the worst things tend to. The rider came in the early afternoon, and this time it was not a young man from Sheridan, but a formally dressed man on a good horse with the bearing of someone who travels professionally, and the kind of coat that costs more than most people in this part of Wyoming made in a month. He had a leather satchel. He asked for Hannah Brooks by name. She came to the door. He introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Croft, representing the firm of Croft and Barlow, Abilene, Kansas. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that the letter to Dr. Alcott and Mrs. Hennessy and the filing in the Kansas court would not end it that people who sent a letter like the one she'd received did not accept the first answer and go home. She had known it, and she had hoped she was wrong, and she had not been wrong. "Mrs. Brooks," Croft said, and the use of Mrs. instead of Miss told her that he'd already done his research. "I wonder if we might speak privately." "We might speak here," Hannah said. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Mr. Walker." Jacob was already at her shoulder. She had not heard him come up behind her, but she felt him there, and the feeling of him there was the feeling of ground under her feet. Croft assessed the situation with professional speed. "As you wish." He opened the satchel. "My clients have reviewed the documents filed in the Kansas court. They have no intention of challenging the guardianship itself. They accept that Clara Brooks designated you as Emma's guardian." Hannah kept her face still. "Then what are you here for?" "My clients are prepared to offer a generous arrangement." He produced a document. "Given that Emma is the heir to her father's estate land, valued at approximately $4,000, my clients are willing to manage that estate until Emma reaches the age of majority. In exchange, they ask only that Emma be permitted to visit Abilene twice yearly so that she may know her paternal family." He made it sound reasonable. Hannah had to admit that he was good at his job. "And the land," Jacob said from behind her shoulder. Croft looked at him. "Managed in trust. My clients would serve as trustees." "Managed," Jacob said, "meaning they make the decisions about it. They would be responsible for its maintenance and profitable development," Jacob said flatly, "which means by the time Emma is old enough to claim it, its value has been appropriated in management fees and development decisions that benefit your clients, and she inherits whatever they've decided to leave her." Croft's face did not change, which was its own answer. "No," Hannah said. "Mrs. Brooks, the alternative is a court proceeding that will be expensive for both sides," Jacob said. "Yes, and we have a lawyer in Cheyenne who has already filed documents establishing Emma's direct claim to the estate with Hannah as her guardian and administrator. So what your clients are actually facing is a court proceeding in which they attempt to override a notarized maternal guardianship and a legal filing supported by 2 witnesses and a very experienced Cheyenne attorney in order to install themselves as trustees of land that they have no blood claim to." He paused. "Tell me, Mr. Croft, have you actually looked at the documents we filed?" Croft was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than professional composure preferred. "My clients are prepared to negotiate," he said. "I'm sure they are," Jacob said. "Here is what's not negotiable. Emma's land will be administered by her legal guardian Hannah, with oversight by our attorney in Cheyenne, until Emma is of age. Your clients are welcome to be named as interested parties in the estate if they wish to establish a relationship with Emma, but they will have no administrative authority and no access to the land's proceeds." He looked at Croft steadily. "That's the arrangement. If your clients want to pursue it in court instead, we'll meet them there." Croft looked at Hannah. Hannah looked back at him. "I'll convey your position," Croft said, and put the document back in his satchel and left. Hannah stood in the doorway for a moment after his horse had gone. She was thinking about $4,000. She was thinking about Clara, who had died in a rented room in Kansas, without knowing her daughter would inherit land, without knowing that the man who had left her had died, and left something behind without knowing any of it. She was thinking about what that land meant, what Emma would have, what Emma would be able to choose, what Clara's daughter would stand on when she was old enough to stand on her own. She turned around. Jacob was still there. "How did you know all that?" she said. "About what they were doing." "Prentice's letter laid it out," he said. He'd seen this particular arrangement before. "It's not uncommon." His jaw was tight in the way it got when something had genuinely angered him, and he was containing it because containing it was more useful than the alternative. They count on women not having someone who can read what they're actually proposing. I would have figured it out, Hannah said. I know you would have, he said, but I was here. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the times in her life she had handled things alone, had stood in doorways like this one, with no one at her shoulder, had read letters and made decisions, and found the next thing and the next thing and the next thing without anyone beside her. She thought about what it felt like to have someone beside her. Yes, she said. You were. He put his hand on her shoulder, brief, steady, the way he touched things he intended to be careful with. Then he went back inside, back to the work that always needed doing, back to the practical language of this man and this ranch and this life that was improbably and completely becoming hers. Hannah stood in the doorway one more moment. The January wind came across the Wyoming flats, and the land went on in every direction without apology, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And somewhere inside the house, Emma was pulling herself along the furniture, practicing the art of walking towards something. And Hannah Brooks stood in the threshold, between outside and in, and breathed once slowly, and went home. Prentice's response to Croft arrived in Sheridan 12 days later, and Danny read it aloud at the breakfast table with the particular relish of a man who spent 3 years in a law office, dreaming of moments exactly like this one. The Abilene family had withdrawn, not gracefully. There was nothing graceful in the letter, which was precise and cold, and made clear that Croft and Barlow had advised their clients that pursuing the matter further carried significant legal risk and disproportionate cost relative to the probable outcome. They were withdrawing their claim to trusteeship. They were not the letter noted with the careful language of people leaving a door technically open, withdrawing their interest in maintaining a familial relationship with the child at some future date should that be agreeable to her guardian. That last part, Hannah said, means nothing, Danny said. Standard language. They're covering the possibility that Emma's land appreciates significantly over the next 17 years, and they want to have been on record as interested parties. He set the letter down. It has no legal weight. Prentice says ignore it. I intend to, Hannah said. Good. Danny folded the letter. He looked around the table with the expression of a man who has thoroughly enjoyed being useful. Also, for what it's worth, Prentice says you've got one of the cleaner guardianship cases he's seen. Says if anyone ever tries this again, the record is solid enough to stop them in a single filing. Jacob looked up from his coffee. No one is going to try it again, he said in the quiet voice that meant the subject was closed. No one argued. Emma, seated in her new position of dignity at the corner of the table, in the high chair that Pete had built over 3 evenings, with the focused intensity of a man with a mission, banged her spoon against the tray and said, "Da," which was her newest word, and which she deployed with democratic enthusiasm toward Jacob, toward Hector, toward Roy, and occasionally toward the barn cat when it appeared in the kitchen doorway. Jacob's response to being called Da by Emma had evolved over the 2 weeks since she'd started doing it. The first time he had gone very still. The second time he had looked at Hannah with an expression she couldn't entirely read. By the third time, he had simply looked at Emma and said in his usual voice, "Eat your oatmeal," which was as close to acceptance as Jacob Walker got, without a formal announcement. Hannah watched him. Now watched him reach over without looking up from the accounts he was reviewing and straighten Emma's spoon in her hand so she could use it better, a gesture so automatic and so tender that he clearly did not know he was doing it. She filed it away with all the other things she had filed away over these months. The firewood, the honey jar, the cradle. Emma's first steps. A hand held briefly in a room full of firelight. A man who had spent 12 years learning not to need anyone quietly and completely needing someone. February came in cold and stayed cold, the kind of cold that makes demands on everything, on the cattle, on the buildings, on the people, on the patience required to keep a large operation running, when every task takes twice as long because the world itself is working against you. Jacob was out before dawn most mornings and back after dark most evenings, and Hannah kept the kitchen warm and the food ready and the lamps lit. And when he came in, she had something hot on the table, and she did not make conversation until he'd had 10 minutes of sitting down with coffee, because she had learned that Jacob Walker needed to come back from the cold the way a person comes back from somewhere far away gradually, in stages. He had learned things about her too. He had learned that she dealt with worry by cooking, that when something was sitting on her mind, the kitchen output increased dramatically, and that a day that produced 4 pies and 2 loaves of bread and a batch of preserves was a day when Hannah had something she hadn't said yet. He had learned that she laughed at things she found genuinely funny, and not at things she didn't, and that this made her laugh worth considerable more than most people's. He had learned that she talked to Emma in full sentences and treated the baby's responses as legitimate contributions to the conversation, and that this was not eccentricity, but philosophy, a belief that people deserved to be spoken to as though their understanding mattered before they'd proven it. He had learned that she was, of all the people he'd met in 35 years of living, the person he least wanted to be in a different room from. He had not said this to her directly. He didn't need to. She knew. The knowing was in every morning and every evening and every moment in between. March arrived with the particular Wyoming ambivalence of a season that hasn't decided yet. Cold one day, the faint promise of something else the next. The kind of weather that makes people restless in the best possible way. The men who had left for winter quarters began returning. The ranch woke up around its edges, noise-returning activity, picking up the quiet of the deep winter, giving way to the productive chaos of a working ranch reassembling itself for the season ahead. And with the returning men came a question that had been sitting at the back of everything since Christmas Eve, and Jacob's quiet yes and Hannah's quieter yes back. A question that the practical demands of winter had allowed to wait, but that spring was not going to allow to wait any longer. It was Hector who said it, because Hector said the things that needed saying. He appeared in the kitchen doorway one morning when Hannah was alone, Emma playing on the floor, and he said without preamble, "The men are asking." Hannah looked up. "About the arrangement," Hector said with the delicacy of a man raising something that is not his business, and knows it, but has decided it's important enough to raise anyway. "Between you and Walker. They're not asking me directly. They're not asking anyone directly. But they're aware of the general situation, and there are 2 new hands coming for spring roundup who won't know you, and it matters what they think my position is," Hannah said. "It matters what your position is," Hector said. "For you, not for them." She understood what he was saying. She had understood it for weeks, had been sitting with it the way she sat with things that required Jacob to arrive at his own conclusion, patient and steady, and not pushing. But she also understood what Hector was telling her, that patience had a practical limit, that the world outside this kitchen had requirements, and that a woman in an ambiguous situation on a ranch full of men was a woman without the standing she deserved. "I'll talk to Jacob," she said. "Good," Hector said. He turned to leave. "Hector," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. From the beginning." He turned back and looked at her with the steady, weathered directness of a man who has been in the world long enough to know what matters. "You're the best thing that's walked through that door in the 11 years I've been here," he said, "including Walker, and I've worked for him the whole time." He paused. "Don't tell him I said that." "I won't," Hannah said. He nodded and left, and Hannah stood in the kitchen for a moment, with Emma pulling at her skirt from the floor, and thought about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. She told herself she would find the right moment. The right moment found her first. Jacob came in at noon earlier than usual, shaking the cold off his coat in the hallway, and Hannah had lunch on, and Emma down for her midday sleep, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and it was just the 2 of them at the table, which was not unusual anymore, but still felt each time like something specific. She set his plate down. She sat across from him. She said, "I need to talk to you about something." He set down his fork. He looked at her with the full attention he gave everything that mattered. "All right. Hector came to see me this morning." A pause. "What did he say?" What he said was correct, and he was right to say it. She looked at Jacob directly, because this was a conversation that required eye contact, and she intended to give it. "Spring is starting. New men coming. I've been here since August. I'm in your house, Jacob. I'm raising a child in your house. And we've said things to each other that mean something, and I believe they mean something to you the same way they mean something to me, but—" She stopped. "I need to know where we stand. Not because of the men, not because of what people think, but because I have a child to raise and I need to be able to plan, and I've been waiting for you to bring this up. And I think you've been waiting for the right moment, and I think the right moment has been and gone, and we're past it." Jacob was quiet. "I'm not pressing you," she said, and then reconsidered, because honesty was worth more than comfort at this particular moment. "Actually, I am pressing you, a little, because it's March and I need to know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I looked into the circuit preacher's schedule last week." Hannah stared at him. "He comes through Sheridan in April," Jacob said. "Stops at the Calvary Church on the 14th. I thought if that was agreeable we could go into town." He picked up his fork, set it back down, looked at her with the expression of a man who has said something significant in the most understated way possible and is unsure of its reception. "If you wanted to." "Jacob Walker," Hannah said. "Hannah. Did you just tell me our wedding date without asking me first?" He considered this. "I told you a possible date," he said. "I'm asking now." She looked at him across the table. She thought about August, about standing in the dust with a carpet bag and a baby on her hip, and this man's cold face telling her she would leave in the morning. She thought about every morning since. She thought about who they had been then and who they were now, and the distance between those two things and what it had taken to cross it. "April 14th, she said. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. He picked up his fork and went back to his lunch, and Hannah did the same, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and ordinary, and outside the March wind said something to the Wyoming flats, and the flats said something back, and Emma slept in the next room, dreaming whatever 10-month-old babies dream, and this was, Hannah thought, exactly what happiness felt like in its actual form, not dramatic, not loud, not the way stories usually told it, but this two people at a table in a warm kitchen who have chosen each other and know it and don't need it to be anything other than what it is. She heard Pete's voice outside a minute later, saying something to Cal about the fence line, and then Cal's response, and then both of them talking over each other the way they always did. And the ordinary noise of the ranch filling back in around the quiet of the kitchen. And it was all of it together, that was the life. She had not known in August that this was what she was walking toward. She was grateful in a way that went too deep for easy expression that she had walked toward it anyway. The morning of April 14th arrived with the specific quality of a day that knows it is significant and has decided to cooperate. The ranch was up early, all of them, which was not required and had not been discussed, but which happened naturally the way things happened in a household that had become a household, rather than just a collection of people sharing a space. Pete had cleaned his boots so thoroughly the night before that Cal had commented on it, which had led to an argument that was resolved when Roy pointed out that they were all cleaning their boots, at which point the argument dissolved into something more like laughter. Hector wore his good coat. Danny had somehow produced a collar that was significantly better than his usual one, which he refused to explain. Roy appeared with his beard trimmed in a way that suggested he had given the matter considerable prior thought. Hannah wore the dress she had been working on for 3 weeks quietly in the evenings, after Emma was asleep, dark blue wool, that she had purchased on a trip to Sheridan with Hector in early March, fitted properly, and finished with the small careful details that she put into things she intended to keep. She had made Emma a dress from the same cloth, a tiny version with small buttons down the back, and when she dressed Emma in it that morning and sat her up to look at her, Emma grabbed her own skirt with both fists and looked down at it with great seriousness. "I know," Hannah told her. "You look beautiful." Emma looked up at her and said, "Ma," which was new this week, which Hannah had been carrying around in her chest, like something breakable and precious since the first time she'd heard it. "Yes," Hannah said. "That's right." She picked Emma up and carried her into the main room, and Jacob was there in his good coat, his hat in his hands, and he looked at her when she came through the door with the expression he reserved for things that hit him squarely. And without warning, the expression she had come to understand meant that he was moved in a way he didn't have full language for and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You look," he started. "So do you," she said. He looked down at Emma. Emma looked up at him and reached for his collar because Emma's position on Jacob Walker had been clear and consistent since the day she'd walked 4 steps across a kitchen floor straight into his hands. He held out his hand, and she grabbed his finger and held on. "Ready," he said. "Yes," Hannah said. They went. The ceremony in Sheridan was small and direct, which was correct for both of them. The circuit preacher was a practical man who understood that some people came to be witnessed and not to be lectured, and he read the relevant words and asked the relevant questions and received the relevant answers. And when he pronounced them married, he did it with the quiet authority of someone who has done this in many different circumstances and understands that the meaning comes from the people, not the performance. Jacob put the ring on Hannah's hand. A plain gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Cheyenne in February. Ordered it before she had formally said yes, because he had made up his mind before she had and had been prepared to wait however long it took. And he held her hand for a moment after and looked at her, and everything that was between them was in that look, all of it, the whole long arc from August to April, from stranger to this. Emma, held by Hector during the ceremony, said "da" at the moment the preacher said husband and wife, and Danny made a sound that was definitely not a laugh, and definitely was, and Roy looked at the ceiling. Hannah laughed. Jacob looked at Emma. Emma looked back at him with enormous satisfaction. "She has good timing," Jacob said. "She always has," Hannah said. They had lunch at the hotel in Sheridan, all of them, the whole lot of them, crowded around a table that was slightly too small. Eating food that was significantly worse than what Hannah made at the ranch, which Danny pointed out and which everyone agreed with, and which Hannah found more moving than any formal compliment anyone had paid her because it meant they knew what they had at home and valued it. Hector raised his coffee cup. He looked around the table, at all of them. Pete, Cal Roy, Danny, Jacob, Hannah, Emma, currently attempting to eat a bread roll that was nearly as large as her head, and he said, "To the Walker Ranch," and then he looked at Hannah and to the woman who gave it a heart. The cups went up. Emma threw her bread roll. Everyone agreed it was the best toast they'd ever heard. The first morning back at the ranch, as a married woman, Hannah stood at the stove at 4 o'clock the way she always did, building the fire, mixing the biscuits, starting the coffee. And the house was dark and quiet around her, and Emma was asleep, and Jacob was asleep, and the men were in the bunkhouse, and the Wyoming dawn was still an hour away. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence of a sleeping house and understood that this exact moment, this ordinary morning was the thing. Not the wedding, not the ring, not the legal resolution of Emma's claim, or the letter from Prentice, or the night Jacob had asked badly and she had said yes. All of those things mattered, but this was the thing standing in a kitchen that was hers, in a house that was hers, making food for people who would come through that door in an hour and be fed and warmed and cared for, and go back out into the world with something solid inside them. She had not known in August that this was waiting for her. She had known only that Emma needed her, and the road was forward, and she had to keep going. Jacob appeared in the doorway at 4:15, the way he always did, drawn by the warmth of the kitchen, or the smell of the coffee, or something less nameable than either of those things. He was dressed already the way he always was. He looked at her at the stove. She looked at him in the doorway. Good morning was not what passed between them. Something did, but it was not that simple, and it did not need words. He sat down. She poured his coffee. She set it in front of him and went back to the biscuits. "Cattle look good," he said. "I'm glad," she said. "Spring roundup starts Monday." "I know. I'll have extra made ahead." He drank his coffee. She worked the dough. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, the sky began to consider lightning. "Hannah," he said. Thank you," he said, "for staying." She turned around. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded honesty of a man who is awake before sunrise and has not yet put the careful parts back in place, and she saw in his face everything she had come to love about him. the steadiness, the depth, the particular courage of a man who had been broken by loss and chosen slowly against every instinct trained into him by grief to try again. "Thank you for not making me leave," she said. He almost smiled. "The storm helped." "The storm helped," she agreed. Emma's voice came from the small room. The preliminary sounds, the working up to fully awake sequence that Hannah knew as well as her own heartbeat. Jacob stood before she could cross the kitchen and went into the small room, and Hannah heard him say something low and quiet to the baby, and heard Emma's sounds shift from waking complaint to something else entirely, the particular contented noise of a child who has been picked up by someone she trusts. He came back into the kitchen with Emma against his shoulder, her dark head tucked under his chin, already settling back toward sleep in the way babies do when they're held correctly by the right person. He sat back down at the table. He held Emma in one arm and picked up his coffee with the other hand, and went back to the account book he'd brought in with him, and Emma slept against his chest, and Hannah turned back to the biscuits, and the kitchen was warm, and the dawn was coming. And this was the life. The summer brought the harvest celebration, which was the valley's tradition, and which the Walker Ranch had not hosted in 9 years, and which Jacob offered to host this year without making a significant announcement about it. Simply told Hector to spread the word to the neighboring ranches that the Walker place would be open the last Saturday of September, and let Hannah do what Hannah did. What Hannah did was considerable. 3 days of cooking before the event. Roasts and pies and bread and preserves and things that had simmered for hours, and things that had been prepared weeks ahead and stored against this weekend. Pete and Cal and Roy and Danny spent a full day setting up tables outside and moving benches from the barn and stringing lanterns that Hannah had ordered from Sheridan specifically for this night. The neighbors came. More of them than Jacob had expected, more than had come the last time the Walker Ranch had hosted anything 9 years ago, when it had been a smaller and quieter event, and Jacob had been a younger and quieter man. Tom Crawford came, which Jacob had not anticipated, and Hannah had. And when Crawford arrived, he stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, looking at the tables and the lanterns and the people and the sound of it. And then he walked over to Hannah and said, with the particular effort of a man who does not do this easily, "I was wrong to say what I said that day. About your situation." Hannah looked at him. "I was wrong," he said again, because he was the kind of man who once he'd decided to do something did it completely. "Thank you for saying so," Hannah said. "Would you like some pie?" Crawford blinked. He had been prepared for several responses, and not for that one. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I would." She handed him a plate. He ate 3 slices before the evening was over, and told Danny, who told everyone that it was the best cherry pie he'd ever had in his life, which was the kind of redemption that Hannah privately considered more satisfying than the formal kind. Emma walked the full length of the yard by herself that evening, not holding anything, not reaching for anyone, just walking with the tottering certainty of a child who has been practicing something for months and is ready to show the world what she can do. The neighbors who saw it did not know the whole story, did not know about August and the storm and the carpet bag and a promise made in a rented room in Kansas, but they saw a child walking toward a man who crouched down with his arms open and caught her when she arrived, and they saw his face when he caught her, and they saw the woman watching from nearby with a particular expression. And they understood what they were looking at, even without knowing the details. "Walker's doing all right," one of the older ranchers said to another watching. "Better than all right," the other said. "What changed?" The first rancher looked at Hannah, who was laughing at something Hector had said, Emma now on Jacob's shoulders, looking extremely pleased with her elevation. "Got himself a cook," he said. Hector, who was close enough to hear this, said nothing, but the expression on his face said everything. Later, after the neighbors had gone, and the men had cleaned up with the efficiency of people who have learned that cleanup is part of the celebration and not its unfortunate aftermath, and Emma was asleep in her cradle in the main room, Hannah and Jacob stood outside in the September dark, listening to the valley settle back into quiet. It was the kind of night that Wyoming occasionally produced, as though in apology for its winters. The air cool, but not cold. The stars in their full, incomprehensible number. The land stretched out in every direction, holding its breath. "You should do this every year," Jacob said. "We should do this every year," Hannah said. He was quiet for a moment. She heard the difference between his silences. Now she knew this one, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I wrote that advertisement, the one you answered, I had convinced myself I only needed a cook." He looked at the sky. "I knew the house was empty. I knew something was missing. But I called it a cook because that was the safe version, something practical, something I could justify." Hannah did not say anything. She let him find it. "I didn't know what I was asking for," he said. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I didn't know, but you did." He looked at her. "You knew you were bringing more than I'd asked for. You came anyway." "I needed the work," she said. "Hannah." She looked at him. "You knew," he said again quietly. She thought about it honestly. She thought about standing on the platform in Wichita with Emma and the carpet bag and the advertisement folded in her pocket. Thinking about a ranch in Wyoming and a man who needed a cook and a baby who needed a home and a promise she had made to a dying woman and all the ways those things could fit together if someone was brave enough to try. "I hoped," she said. "That's not quite the same as knowing." "Close enough," Jacob said. She felt his hand find hers in the dark, the same way he'd held it in the main room on Christmas Eve. Careful, complete, like something worth keeping warm. They stood there in the Wyoming dark with the stars above them, and the house behind them, and Emma asleep in her cradle, and the men in the bunkhouse, and the cattle in the pastures, and the whole long weight of a life that had been built piece by piece and day by day and promise by promise into something that would hold. "Jacob," she said. She called you Da again today, 3 times. She knows what it means." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Does that—" "Yes," he said, before she could finish the question. "It does." She pressed her hand against his. They stood there until the cold finally made its case, and they went inside back to the warm kitchen, and the sleeping baby, and the life that had started with a storm, and a woman who refused to leave, and a man who had forgotten how to need anyone until someone arrived who made forgetting impossible. The neighbors of Sheridan Valley would remember that harvest celebration for years. They would say that the Walker place had always been a good ranch, solid and well run, the kind of operation you could count on. But from that fall onward, they would say something else about it, something that was harder to quantify and more important. They would say it was the warmest home in the valley, the kind of place where the coffee was always on and the bread was always fresh, and you came away from it feeling that the world was fundamentally decent, that hard things could become good things, that a door opened at the right moment to the right person could change everything. They would say, you could tell the difference the moment you walked in. They were right. Jacob Walker had sent for a cook. He had gotten something that had no simple name, a woman of extraordinary courage carrying an unbreakable promise who had walked through his door in the middle of a storm and rebuilt everything he had given up, believing in one morning at a time, one meal at a time, one kept promise at a time, until the empty place at the center of his life was so thoroughly filled that he could no longer remember exactly what the emptiness had felt like, only that it had been there and that it was gone, and that the woman who had taken it away had done it without being asked and without apology, and with the complete quiet certainty of someone who had decided somewhere between Kansas and Wyoming that this was where she was supposed to be. She had been right. She had always been right. And on the Walker Ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming, in the year of 1889, and every year that came after it, the kitchen fire burned before dawn, and the coffee was strong, and the door was open, and a family that had found each other against every reasonable odd lived the life they had built together fully, warmly, and without a single wasted moment of the love they had both almost missed.